Number 1. Carla Hughes. She was young, successful, and admired in her community. Carla Hughes appeared to be everything a parent could want in a role model for their children. A middle school teacher in Jackson, Mississippi, and a graduate student with big ambitions. On the surface, she had charm and intelligence, the kind of woman who seemed destined for a bright future. But what unfolded in 2006 shocked everyone who thought they knew her. Behind the calm exterior was a storm of jealousy, obsession, and desperation that would end in 2 tragic deaths and a life sentence with no chance of parole. Carla grew up with respect for education and worked her way into a promising career. She was teaching language arts while also pursuing a master's degree at Jackson State University. Colleagues described her as well put together and focused. But away from school, her personal life was far more complicated. She had fallen into a love triangle with her cousin's fiancé, a man named Keon Pittman. He was engaged to 27-year-old Avis Banks, who was pregnant with their first child. Despite knowing this, Carla began an affair with him, believing she had a chance at something more permanent. The situation spiraled in November 2006. Avis, who worked as an assistant teacher herself, was preparing to become a mother. She was just weeks away from giving birth when she came home one evening. As she entered her garage, she was ambushed. She died at the scene, along with her unborn child. The community was horrified, and the brutality of the crime stunned investigators. Almost immediately, suspicion fell on Keon, the fiancé. But as detectives began pulling apart the threads, a second figure emerged in the shadows: Carla Hughes. Investigators learned that Carla had been pressuring Keon, asking him to leave Avis and start a life with her instead. Friends recalled conversations where she described Avis as an obstacle. When detectives searched Carla's apartment, they found a handgun and a knife that linked her to the killing. Cell phone records placed her near the home at the exact time Avis was attacked. What had seemed like a tragic case of domestic conflict suddenly revealed a deeper, more chilling layer. Carla was arrested and charged with capital murder in both the death of Avis Banks and her unborn child. The case immediately drew public attention. On one side, her defense argued that Carla was a bright young woman caught up in an affair she couldn't escape. They suggested she was manipulated by Keon and denied that she carried out the crime. On the other side, the prosecution presented a starkly different story: a jealous woman who plotted to eliminate her romantic rival. The evidence was difficult to ignore: weapons in her possession, phone records, and testimony about her growing obsession with Keon. When the trial began in 2009, the courtroom was packed. The prosecution laid out the timeline in meticulous detail. They painted a picture of a calculated ambush fueled by envy and the desire to take Avis's place. The defense tried to introduce doubt, pointing to gaps in the timeline and insisting that Keon himself had more motive and opportunity than Carla. But Keon testified against her, describing the pressure she had put on him and distancing himself from the violence. The jury deliberated carefully, but in the end, the verdict was decisive. Carla Hughes was convicted of 2 counts of capital murder. The sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. For someone who once seemed to embody promise and respectability, the fall was absolute. The judge's words made clear that society could never again trust her outside the walls of a prison. Today, Carla Hughes remains behind bars in Mississippi. Appeals have been filed, but none have succeeded in overturning her conviction. She continues to serve her life sentence with no hope of release. For the families of Avis Banks and her unborn child, the outcome brought some measure of closure, though it could never replace the lives that were lost. The story of Carla Hughes is remembered not only for its tragic violence, but for the striking contrast it revealed. A teacher admired for her poise and intelligence turned out to be hiding dangerous emotions. It serves as a reminder that appearances can mask turmoil, and choices born of jealousy can unravel lives in the most irreversible way. Number 2. Amy Hebert. It began in the quiet suburbs of Louisiana, where Amy Hebert was known as a mother, a teacher's aide, and a neighbor who blended into the rhythms of family life. She worked at an elementary school in Terrebonne Parish and lived in a comfortable home where, from the outside, nothing seemed unusual. But in August 2017, the facade shattered. What looked like the life of a devoted parent became the scene of one of the darkest crimes in recent state history. Amy had spent years working in education and raising her 2 children, a 7-year-old son and a 9-year-old daughter. Friends and co-workers described her as calm and reserved, someone who kept much of her personal struggles private. Behind closed doors, however, her marriage had collapsed. She was locked in a bitter custody dispute with her ex-husband. To those close to her, the situation seemed painful, but not unusual. Plenty of families endure separations and custody battles. Few could have imagined where this one was headed. On the morning of August 20th, 2017, deputies were called to Amy's home in Houma after relatives reported they couldn't reach her. What they found was devastating. Both children had died inside the house, and Amy herself was discovered with serious injuries she had inflicted upon herself in what appeared to be a failed attempt to end her own life. The community, stunned and grieving, immediately began to ask how a mother who had once seemed so nurturing could carry out something so unthinkable. The investigation moved quickly. Detectives pieced together a picture of mounting despair. Amy had written notes blaming her ex-husband for her struggles and suggesting that she couldn't bear to see her children live a life split between parents. Authorities concluded she had acted out of anger and hopelessness, taking the lives of her son and daughter before turning on herself. The evidence, her writings, the timing, and her own survival left little doubt about what had happened inside that home. Amy was arrested while recovering in the hospital. She was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The case drew wide media coverage in Louisiana and beyond, with many struggling to reconcile the image of a school employee and mother with the reality of the charges she faced. Prosecutors prepared for a trial that would hinge on both the facts and the question of motive. When the proceedings began, Amy's defense centered on her fragile mental state. They described her as overwhelmed by depression, abandoned by her ex-husband, and driven by a distorted belief that she was protecting her children from future pain. The prosecution countered with the evidence: 2 young lives taken in cold finality, and a mother who chose an irreversible act instead of seeking help. They emphasized that, however deep her struggles, she had crossed a line that could never be excused. In 2019, the verdict was delivered. Amy Hebert was convicted on both counts of first-degree murder. The judge handed down the harshest possible punishment under Louisiana law: life in prison without the possibility of parole. She was led from the courtroom to begin serving her sentence at the Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women. The children's father, standing in court, wept as the judge made clear that Amy would never leave prison alive. Today, Amy Hebert remains incarcerated. Her name remembered in Louisiana not for the years she spent in classrooms, but for the nightmarish decision that ended her children's lives. The community has tried to heal, honoring the memory of the children while living with the reminder that their loss came at the hands of the person who should have protected them most. Her case is a stark example of how personal despair, when left unchecked, can spiral into destruction. A teacher's aide, once entrusted with shaping young minds, became a symbol of irreversible tragedy. And for those who knew her, the question lingers: could anything have been done to stop her before she crossed that final line? Number 3, Nancy Seaman. In the suburbs of Michigan, Nancy Seaman was the picture of stability. She taught 5th grade at Longacre Elementary School in Farmington Hills, where parents praised her dedication and students saw her as patient and encouraging. To the outside world, she lived a life of order, a respected teacher, a wife, and a mother of 2 sons. But in May 2004, that image collapsed in a single night of violence that turned a well-regarded educator into a convicted killer. Nancy had been married to her husband Bob for over 2 decades. Together they raised 2 boys and built a home that, at least outwardly, looked secure. But behind the closed doors of that household, there were years of turmoil. Nancy would later describe the marriage as filled with conflict, with arguments that grew more bitter as time passed. She claimed she had endured emotional abuse and felt trapped. Friends and colleagues, however, often saw only glimpses. Nancy was skilled at presenting a composed front, focusing on her classroom and her sons while her marriage frayed in the background. On May 10, 2004, everything came to a breaking point. The details that emerged in court painted a picture of a day that began like any other, but spiraled into deadly confrontation. At the center was a hatchet Nancy had purchased earlier that day. Prosecutors argued it was proof of premeditation. Nancy insisted she bought it to cut wood for home projects. That evening, after another argument, the fight escalated until Bob Seaman was killed inside their home. He died at the scene, and Nancy, instead of calling for help immediately, attempted to clean the area before ultimately contacting authorities. The discovery stunned their quiet neighborhood. Police found the evidence impossible to ignore: the recently purchased hatchet, blood traces throughout the house, and inconsistencies in Nancy's statements. She was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The case quickly attracted attention across Michigan because of the shocking contrast: a longtime teacher now standing accused of planning and carrying out her husband's killing. When the trial began in 2005, the courtroom became the stage for 2 competing narratives. The prosecution argued that Nancy had grown resentful of her marriage and plotted to end it permanently. They highlighted the timing of her hatchet purchase and the deliberate nature of the attack. The defense, meanwhile, described years of domestic abuse and insisted Nancy had acted in self-defense during a violent confrontation. They called witnesses who testified about her bruises and emotional state, painting a portrait of a woman pushed past her breaking point. The jury deliberated over these conflicting stories. In the end, they rejected the self-defense claim and found Nancy guilty of first-degree premeditated murder. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For her sons, who had to sit through the trial, it was a devastating outcome. They had lost their father and now watched their mother taken away in handcuffs. Over the years, Nancy has continued to fight her conviction. Her case has gone through numerous appeals, with advocates arguing that the jury failed to fully consider the context of domestic abuse. In 2010, her story even drew national coverage on shows that examined the question of whether she was a victim herself or a calculated killer. But despite these efforts, her life sentence has remained intact. Each appeal has been denied, leaving her future firmly tied to the Michigan prison system. Today, Nancy Seaman remains incarcerated. She is now in her 70s, far removed from the days when she stood at the front of a classroom teaching children to read and write. Her case continues to spark debate. Was she an abused wife who snapped in a moment of desperation, or a woman who planned an escape from her marriage in the most permanent way possible? Whatever the interpretation, the law's judgment was clear. Her story underscores how even lives that seem steady and ordinary can hide intense conflict beneath the surface. A respected teacher with a spotless reputation ultimately became a prisoner, serving life without parole. And for the community she left behind, the shock has never entirely faded. Number 4. Kathleen Dorsett. In the quiet town of Ocean Township, New Jersey, Kathleen Dorsett was once seen as a woman who had it all. A first-grade teacher, she came from a respected family, and her career put her in a position to guide young children during their earliest years of school. Parents trusted her, colleagues admired her, and her life looked like a model of middle-class stability. But in 2010, her name would be linked to a crime so disturbing that it shocked the entire state. What began as a custody dispute ended with the death of her ex-husband and a courtroom scene that left her facing decades behind bars. Kathleen had married a man named Stephen Moore, and together they had a young daughter. By all appearances, the marriage had started with hope, but within a few years, it had soured. Arguments became frequent, and accusations of controlling behavior and resentment surfaced. In 2007, they divorced, and the custody of their daughter became the central conflict. Kathleen wanted primary custody, and so did Stephen. The tug of war over the little girl drove tensions higher with each passing month. On August 16, 2010, the conflict reached its most tragic point. Stephen Moore had just dropped off his daughter at Kathleen's parents' house after a weekend visit. Moments later, he disappeared. Hours passed before anyone realized something was wrong, and by the end of the day, investigators had launched a missing person search. That night, Stephen's body was discovered in the trunk of his mother's car, abandoned in a parking lot. The community recoiled at the news. Not only had a young father lost his life, but the crime appeared to be connected to a bitter custody feud. Detectives quickly turned their focus to Kathleen and her parents, Thomas and Leslie Dorsett. The investigation uncovered chilling details. Stephen had been attacked when he came to the house to drop off his daughter. Prosecutors argued that Kathleen and her father overpowered him, while her mother helped plan what would happen next. The plan, according to the evidence, was to remove Stephen permanently so that custody of the little girl would no longer be in question. In 2011, Kathleen was arrested and charged with murder, alongside her father and mother. The courtroom battle that followed was riveting. The prosecution laid out a timeline showing how the attack took place and how Stephen's body was moved afterward. Witness testimony and forensic evidence tied Kathleen directly to the crime. Her defense team tried to shift responsibility toward her parents, suggesting she had been caught up in their decisions rather than leading the plan. But the jury didn't accept that argument. Kathleen eventually entered a guilty plea to aggravated manslaughter, conspiracy, and related charges. Her father admitted his role as well, while her mother pleaded guilty to conspiracy in exchange for a reduced sentence. Together, the picture that emerged was one of a family united, in a desperate attempt to control a custody outcome, and willing to go to unimaginable lengths to achieve it. The sentencing was severe. Kathleen received 58 years in prison, with no chance of parole until she has served nearly half a century. Her father, Thomas, was also given decades behind bars, while her mother received a shorter term but remained the part of the story. For Kathleen, the punishment meant she would never again see her daughter outside of prison walls. The very child at the center of the dispute was left to grow up without either parent in her life. Today, Kathleen remains in state prison in New Jersey, serving what is effectively a life sentence. Her daughter has been raised by relatives far removed from the turmoil that once surrounded her. For the community, the case stands as a haunting reminder of how custody disputes, battles that usually play out in family court, can sometimes escalate to the most tragic of outcomes. The story of Kathleen Dorsett is remembered not only for the crime itself, but for the involvement of her entire family. A teacher, once entrusted with shaping children's futures, chose destruction over resolution. And in doing so, she lost her freedom, her family, and the trust of a community that had once seen her as a role model. Number 5. Jacqueline Ma. In San Diego, California, Jacqueline Ma was the kind of teacher who seemed destined for awards. She taught 6th grade at Lincoln Acres Elementary School and was celebrated for her creativity in the classroom. In 2022, she was even named Teacher of the Year, a recognition that made her a symbol of excellence in education. To parents and administrators, she was the model of what a young, dedicated educator should be. But in March 2023, that golden image unraveled. When the truth emerged, the woman once praised as an inspiring role model was sentenced to decades in prison. Jacqueline's early career showed promise. She was in her early 30s, loved by students, and known for her ability to connect with children. Parents spoke highly of her, often saying she had a gift for making kids excited about learning. Colleagues saw her as ambitious, driven, and personable. Few could imagine that behind this professional image, she was forming secret and deeply inappropriate relationships that crossed every boundary of her role as a teacher. The case began when suspicions surfaced in early 2023. Authorities were alerted after a student's family discovered troubling messages on their child's phone. Those messages led investigators directly to Jacqueline. What they uncovered was a pattern that had developed over time, involving grooming, secrecy, and a betrayal of trust that shocked the district and the wider community. She had blurred the lines between teacher and student in ways that left no doubt about her intentions. On March 7, 2023, Jacqueline was arrested and charged with over a dozen counts, including multiple felonies. News of her arrest spread quickly. The same teacher who had been celebrated publicly was now being led away in handcuffs. Parents at Lincoln Acres were stunned. Many had praised her just months earlier, and now they were grappling with the fact that she had used her position of authority in the worst possible way. The legal process moved swiftly. Prosecutors brought forward messages, testimony, and digital evidence that painted a clear picture of exploitation. They argued that Jacqueline had abused her authority, taken advantage of her students' trust, and done irreparable damage to her victims. Her defense team, in contrast, tried to cast her as someone overwhelmed by personal struggles, suggesting she was not in a sound state of mind. But the mountain of evidence was overwhelming, and the courtroom atmosphere was heavy as parents and students testified about the betrayal they felt. By 2024, the case reached its conclusion. Jacqueline Ma was convicted and sentenced to 30 years to life in prison. The severity of the sentence reflected not only the crimes themselves, but also the trust she had violated. For many in the community, the sentence felt necessary to send a message. Teachers hold a position of sacred responsibility, and when that responsibility is broken, the consequences must be severe. Today, Jacqueline is serving her sentence in a California state prison. Her teaching career is over, her reputation destroyed, and the title of Teacher of the Year, once her proudest achievement, has become a bitter reminder of how quickly admiration can turn to outrage. The students she once guided are left with memories of betrayal, and their families continue to grapple with the fallout. Her case is often cited as one of the most shocking in recent California history, not because of the length of her sentence alone, but because of how completely it contradicted her public image. She went from celebrated educator to convicted felon almost overnight, a fall so steep it still resonates as a cautionary tale. For those who trusted her, the lesson is clear. Sometimes the brightest accolades hide the darkest secrets, and in Jacqueline Ma's case, the trust that once lifted her to the top of her profession became the very reason her fall was so catastrophic. Number 6. Melissa Marie Curtis. In Charles County, Maryland, 31-year-old Melissa Marie Curtis was known as a teacher who blended in quietly with her peers. She taught at Benjamin Stoddart Middle School and carried herself as someone who had her life on track. Parents trusted her, students saw her every day in the classroom, and the community assumed she was exactly what she appeared to be, another ordinary teacher shaping young lives. But in 2023, her carefully maintained exterior began to crack. Within months, it would collapse completely, ending with a sentence so long that even though most of it was suspended, the official punishment made headlines across the state. Melissa's background looked typical. She had earned her credentials, secured a teaching position, and seemed dedicated to her students. Friends described her as personable but private, someone who didn't reveal much about her personal struggles. But behind closed doors, she was developing an inappropriate relationship that crossed every line of her professional responsibilities. It began with small interactions, then secret communications, and before long, she had put her entire career and freedom at risk. The turning point came in late 2023, when a student's parents noticed unusual behavior and eventually uncovered evidence of an illicit relationship. They went directly to law enforcement. Once detectives began their investigation, the evidence quickly mounted. Messages, timelines, and testimonies pointed clearly to Melissa. What shocked investigators most was not only the breach of trust, but the methodical way she had maintained secrecy. She was arrested in early 2024, and the news shook the school community. Parents were outraged, students were confused, and administrators scrambled to explain how someone entrusted with children could cross such dangerous boundaries. The arrest report described multiple incidents, and prosecutors wasted no time pressing charges. Melissa was indicted on a series of counts, including charges of sexual misconduct with a minor. The weight of the case was heavy, and it attracted coverage across Maryland as another example of betrayal by a trusted authority figure. The legal process moved quickly. In the courtroom, prosecutors laid out their case with detail: the communications, the timeline, the steps she had taken to conceal the truth. They argued that she had knowingly abused her position as a teacher. Her defense admitted some responsibility but pleaded for leniency, pointing to her lack of prior criminal history and mental health struggles. The atmosphere was tense, with parents of the students speaking about the damage done and demanding accountability. In May 2024, sentencing arrived. The judge imposed a 30-year prison sentence, but with most of it suspended. Melissa would serve only 1 year behind bars, followed by a long period of probation and mandatory registration. Still, the official number, 30 years, was splashed across headlines, and to the public, it symbolized how severe her crimes were viewed under the law. For the victim's family, it was a partial measure of justice, even though many wished she would spend far longer in prison. Today, Melissa Curtis remains under state supervision. She completed her first year in custody and now faces years of restrictions that will define the rest of her life. Her career in education is permanently over, her reputation destroyed, and her name placed on registries that will follow her everywhere she goes. What began as a teacher with an ordinary life ended with her branded permanently for a crime that betrayed both her profession and her community. Her story demonstrates how even a seemingly small step across boundaries can spiral into devastating consequences. The official 30-year sentence, regardless of suspension, stands as a reminder of how seriously the justice system views the role of teachers. For those who once trusted her, the sense of betrayal will linger much longer than any official term on paper. Number 7, Jennifer Fichter. In Lakeland, Florida, Jennifer Fichter was supposed to be living her dream. She was a 29-year-old English teacher at a local high school, known for her energy in the classroom and her ability to connect with students. To her colleagues, she seemed bright and ambitious. the kind of educator who could inspire teenagers to care about literature and writing. But by 2014, her career and her future were in ruins. What began as secret communications with students spiraled into one of the most shocking cases in Florida's education system. And it ended with a prison sentence that would keep her behind bars for decades. Jennifer's background gave no hint of what was to come. She had grown up in Florida, earned her teaching degree, and quickly landed a job at Central Florida Aerospace Academy. Students described her as fun and approachable, and she enjoyed the admiration that came with being a young teacher close to their age. But the very traits that made her seem relatable also blurred the boundaries of her role. She began communicating with students outside of school hours, first through casual messages and then through exchanges that became far more serious. The situation unraveled in April 2014 when the mother of a 17-year-old student discovered suspicious messages on her son's phone. What she found exposed a full-blown inappropriate relationship. She reported it immediately, and investigators soon uncovered that Jennifer wasn't involved with just one student. There were three. Each of them had been drawn into the same pattern of secrecy and manipulation. Jennifer was arrested and charged with multiple counts of unlawful activity with minors. The story exploded across Florida news outlets. Parents who had once trusted her were horrified, and school officials quickly severed ties with her. Detectives discovered that she had carefully concealed the relationships, often meeting students late at night in secluded places. The level of planning made it impossible to dismiss her actions as a momentary lapse. As her case moved into the courtroom, the scope of the charges became overwhelming. She faced 37 counts in total, and each carried the possibility of years in prison. The prosecution built its case around the repeated nature of her actions and the deliberate steps she took to avoid detection. They emphasized that she had abused her position as a teacher and inflicted long-term damage on her students. Her defense team urged the judge to consider her mental health struggles, describing her as someone in need of treatment rather than decades in prison. In 2015, the verdict was delivered. Jennifer Fichter pleaded guilty to all counts, and the judge imposed a sentence of 22 years in state prison. The decision sent a strong message across Florida. Teachers who abused their authority would face the harshest penalties the law could impose. For the families of her victims, the outcome brought relief, though it could not undo the harm already done. Today, Jennifer Fichter remains incarcerated, serving her sentence at a Florida state facility. She will not be eligible for release until well into the 2030s, by which time she will be in her 50s. Her case continues to be cited in discussions about teacher misconduct because of the sheer number of charges and the length of her sentence. Her fall from admired young teacher to convicted felon is a reminder of how quickly lives can unravel when boundaries are crossed. Jennifer's story resonates not only because of the severity of her punishment, but also because of the way she squandered the trust of her students, their parents, and her profession. She once seemed like a role model, but her decisions erased every trace of the promise she once held. Number 8, Brittany Zamora. In the desert suburbs of Arizona, Brittany Zamora was supposed to be a rising star in education. At just 27 years old, she taught 6th grade at Las Brisas Academy in Goodyear. Parents admired her energy, students called her fun and approachable, and administrators saw her as a young teacher with a bright future. But in 2018, her name became one of the most infamous in the country. Behind the smile and polished classroom persona, she was hiding behavior that would shock her community and end with a prison sentence that made national headlines. Brittany's background didn't raise any red flags. She was married, well-educated, and active in her school's programs. She seemed to live the kind of suburban life that looked picture perfect from the outside. But in late 2017, she began forming secret connections with one of her 13-year-old students. What started with compliments and friendly conversations quickly escalated into late-night messages and an inappropriate relationship that crossed every boundary of trust. The case broke open in March 2018 when the student's parents grew suspicious. They had installed a monitoring app on their child's phone and were horrified by what they discovered: explicit exchanges between their son and his teacher. They reported it immediately to the police, setting off an investigation that would dominate Arizona news for months. Detectives soon confirmed that Brittany had been meeting with the student outside of school hours and taking deliberate steps to conceal the relationship. Her arrest shocked the community. Parents who had once trusted her were stunned to see her in handcuffs. The case spread quickly across national media, not only because of her age and career, but also because of the level of secrecy involved. Prosecutors filed multiple felony charges, including exploitation of a minor, and emphasized the harm caused to the victim and his family. The legal process moved rapidly. In court, the prosecution brought forward text messages, testimony, and witness accounts that left little room for doubt. They described how Brittany used her authority and position as a teacher to gain access and manipulate the situation. Her defense team argued for leniency, pointing to her lack of prior criminal history and insisting she had the potential for rehabilitation. But the weight of the evidence was overwhelming. In July 2019, Brittany Zamora was sentenced to 20 years in state prison. The judge's ruling reflected both the severity of her crimes and the need to protect the community. She was also ordered to serve lifetime probation after her release and will be required to register permanently. For Brittany, the sentence meant she would not be eligible for freedom until her mid-40s, long after the teaching career she once built had vanished. Today, Brittany is incarcerated at Perryville Prison in Arizona. Reports suggest she has spent her time in custody working with other inmates on educational programs, a striking reminder of her former career. But her name remains synonymous with betrayal. The families who once entrusted her with their children will never forget what she took from them. Her case has since become a reference point in discussions about misconduct in schools, often cited alongside others as an example of how even seemingly promising teachers can use their positions in harmful ways. For her community, the transformation from admired educator to convicted felon was both fast and devastating. The story of Brittany Zamora shows how appearances can be deceiving. A teacher once celebrated for her energy and promise is now remembered for the choices that ended her career and her freedom. And for the victims and their families, the scars left behind will last far longer than any prison sentence. Number 9, Pamela Smart. In the early 1990s, Pamela Smart's case gripped the nation, becoming one of the first trials to be broadcast gavel to gavel on television. Though it unfolded decades ago, its impact has stretched well into the modern era, with appeals and public debate keeping her name alive through the 2000s and 2010s. Once a school media coordinator in New Hampshire, Pamela was supposed to be a guide for students exploring journalism and communication. Instead, she became known as the teacher who orchestrated a shocking plan that ended with her husband's death and a life sentence without parole. Pamela Smart seemed to have it all. She had married Greg Smart, worked in the local high school, and presented herself as an ambitious, upwardly mobile young woman. But beneath the surface, her marriage was crumbling. Pamela began a relationship with a 15-year-old student, Billy Flynn, a decision that would set off a chain of events more dramatic than any novel or film. When she confided in him about her dissatisfaction with Greg and her fears of divorce, the situation escalated into something darker. She pushed Flynn and his friends toward a plan that would permanently remove her husband from the picture. On May 1st, 1990, Greg Smart was found dead in the couple's home. At first, police believed it was a botched burglary, but inconsistencies began to pile up. Investigators learned about Pamela's relationship with Flynn, and soon Flynn himself confessed. He told police that Pamela had pressured him into killing Greg, insisting that she would leave him if he didn't go through with it. His confession led directly back to Pamela, turning her from grieving widow to prime suspect. The investigation revealed a web of manipulation. Flynn and 3 of his friends had carried out the attack, but prosecutors argued Pamela was the mastermind. Recordings captured her making incriminating statements, and witnesses testified about her role in planning the crime. The story exploded in the media, with news outlets across the country fixating on the scandalous combination of a teacher, a teenage student, and a violent crime. Her trial in 1991 was a media spectacle. The prosecution framed her as a manipulator who exploited a teenager's infatuation for her own gain. The defense argued she had been reckless, but not directly involved in planning the killing. In the end, the jury sided with the prosecution. Pamela Smart was convicted of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and being an accomplice. The sentence was severe: life in prison without the possibility of parole. For someone who had once worked in a high school helping students with journalism projects, the fall was absolute. The young student she manipulated, Billy Flynn, received a lighter sentence due to his age and later became eligible for release. But Pamela would remain behind bars forever. In the decades since, Pamela has fought tirelessly to overturn her conviction. She has filed multiple appeals, claiming that her trial was biased and that her sentence was disproportionate compared to those who actually carried out the attack. Each attempt has failed. In 2021, her most recent plea for clemency was denied, leaving her with no legal pathway out of prison. Today, Pamela Smart is serving her sentence in Bedford Hills Correctional Facility in New York. She has earned advanced degrees while incarcerated and often speaks publicly about prison life through interviews. Yet despite her efforts to reshape her image, the crime she was convicted of continues to overshadow everything else. For the families involved, the life sentence remains the only measure of justice for Greg Smart's death. Pamela's story is remembered not only for its sensational trial, but for what it represented: the collision of authority, manipulation, and betrayal. A school staff member who once held influence over students used that power for destructive ends. More than 3 decades later, her name still stands as one of the most notorious examples of a teacher figure crossing every line and paying with her freedom for the rest of her life. Number 10. Mary Kay Letourneau. Few cases in American history have generated as much controversy as that of Mary Kay Letourneau. A teacher in Washington state, she went from being an elementary school instructor and mother of 4 to one of the most infamous figures in the country. Her name became synonymous with betrayal of trust, scandal, and a lengthy prison term that permanently changed the way the public viewed boundaries in the classroom. Mary Kay was born into a politically connected family in California and later built a career as a teacher in Burien, Washington. She was married with children and lived in a suburban neighborhood that seemed almost idyllic. Parents saw her as devoted, creative, and invested in her students' success. But in 1996, her carefully maintained image unraveled. She crossed a boundary with one of her 12-year-old students, igniting a chain of events that would dominate headlines for years. The relationship first came to light when police found her with the boy in her car in 1997. She was arrested and charged, and the case exploded into national attention. The sheer shock of a teacher engaging in such a relationship with a 6th grader made her story one of the most sensational scandals of the decade. prosecutors emphasized that she had abused her position of authority and caused irreparable harm. In 1997, Mary Kay pleaded guilty to 2 counts of felony misconduct and was sentenced to 6 months in jail with strict conditions. She was ordered to avoid all contact with the student. But just weeks after her release, she was caught with him again, violating the court order. This time, the consequences were much harsher. The judge sentenced her to 7.5 years in prison, a sentence that reflected both her actions and her defiance of the court's conditions. During her imprisonment, the case remained in the media spotlight. She gave interviews, her family fractured, and her relationship with the student, who by then was a teenager, continued to draw attention. When she was finally released in 2004, she attempted to rebuild her life, but the notoriety never faded. The scandal overshadowed any chance of returning to a normal life or teaching career. In an extraordinary turn, she later married the former student in 2005 after he reached adulthood. Their marriage lasted more than a decade before ending in separation. For many, that fact only deepened the controversy. A teacher once entrusted with children had turned one of them into her partner, further blurring the line between victim and spouse. Mary Kay Letourneau's case remains one of the most discussed teacher scandals in U.S. history. She was never sentenced to life like some of the other names on this list, but the combination of media frenzy, repeated violations, and the collapse of her career cemented her place in the public consciousness. She passed away in 2020 after a battle with cancer, still remembered less as an educator and more as a cautionary tale of broken trust. Her story closed an era, but continues to serve as a warning. When authority is abused in a school setting, the fallout doesn't just destroy a career, it reshapes lives forever.